Good evening everyone and welcome to John 23rd College. My name is Neve and on behalf of our college community, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Perth launch of Pope Francis, the Disruptive Pilgrim's Guide. Before we begin, just a few brief housekeeping notes. The toilets are located at the back of the room and in the event of an emergency, please follow the directions of staff and assemble on the lawn area outside. And finally, please ensure your mobile phone is turned to silent. We are delighted to host this evening and welcome to such a distinguished group of speakers. Tonight we will hear from Mr. Daniel Mann, our college principal, Alyssa, the 2025 winner of the Atticus Finch Justice Award, and Fr Eamonn Conway, who has generously stepped in to support this book launch, as well as Fr Brennan, who is the author of the Pope Francis, the Disruptive Pilgrim's Guide, and was written when he was our academic in residence last August. This evening is especially meaningful for our community, as we see each of our three founders as disruptors who have disrupted and challenged the Church in constructive ways. Pope John XXIII disrupted expectations of the papacy by opening the windows of the Church through the Second Vatican Council, trusting that renewal came not from the fear, but from hope and dialogue. Mary Ward challenged the norms of her time by insisting that women could live active religious lives beyond cloistered walls, educating and serving others in bold, new ways. And St. Ignatius of Loyola transformed spiritual life by offering the spiritual exercises and a missionary vision that helped people discover God in everyday life. It is fitting then that conversations about Pope Francis, himself a gentle but courageous disruptor, takes place in a community shaped by the spirit of these faithful trailblazers. To begin our evening in the spirit of respect and reflection, I now invite you to join us in acknowledgement of country, followed by our college prayer. Thank you and welcome.
We acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional custodians of the land on which John 23rd College stands. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and honour their deep and enduring connection to this land, its waters and skies. Here on this country, where our college community now learns and grows, we are reminded of our shared responsibility to care for creation and walk together in a spirit of reconciliation. May we, like our founders, St. John XXIII, Mary Ward, and Ignatius Loyola, seek truth, justice, and hope as we journey forward, learning from the wisdom of those who have walked this land for tens of thousands of years. Let us pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord, you gave our founders a sense of vision and action. As members of the John 23rd College community, we pray for competence to do our work well, conscience to live in truth, compassion to open our hearts to those in need, and commitment to respond to God at all times. May our happiness come from the joy of serving others. As we plan for tomorrow and live our lives today, may we seek justice. We make this prayer through Christ our Lord and with the intercession of our founders, Pope John XXIII, Mary Ward, Ignatius of Loyola. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Mann to the stage.
Well, thank you, Matt, and welcome everyone. Particularly warm welcome to those that have never been to our college community before. And I also recognise some familiar faces, but you've been away for a while and you're back, so welcome back. This is a really special time for our college, and what better place to launch a book written by a Jesuit about a Jesuit called The Disruptive Pilgrim's Guide, as Neve said, when we have three founders that were particularly disruptive. And one in particular was also jailed twice for being so countercultural and really jailed by the church that she loves so much. So courage is a theme that runs true. We were privileged to have Father Frank here as our academic in residence last year, and that was a very special time for us as a college to have an extended stay of Father Frank. And during that time, Frank spent a lot of time with both students and staff. We were just talking just before, the weather was atrocious at the time, and that was a really good time for writing, and we're the beneficiaries of that writing. So there's something in that, but more than that, What also happened at that time was we have what's called the Atticus Finch Justice Awards, and there were finals at the time, and we invited Frank to be on the panel of judges for those finals. The Atticus Finch Justice Award, it's the culmination of a cross-curricular program that we have here at the college. So it's working with the English department and the religious education department work together. And it's a program that really centres on Harper Lee's novel To Kill a Mockingbird and the study of that. And what we do here at the college is we do the traditional and consider that from an English literature lens. But we also consider it from a religious education lens as well, and Catholic social teachings. And that culminates in a series of high quality, I must say, speeches that are given. And the finals are then judged, and we have an award winner. And Alyssa Minyaka, who's with us this evening, was the award winner for last year. And I think it's really interesting and poignant that we have Alyssa speak to us today, and is our first speaker, on the reflection of such a powerful book. And I'd like to invite Alyssa to the stage, and can you please warmly welcome Alyssa as she actually approaches the lectern.
Good afternoon, everyone. When Mrs. Murphy first came up to me asking me to make this speech, I have to admit I was caught a little off guard. In all honesty, I was seriously wondering what comments of value that I would be able to make on a respected Jesuit's book about Pope Francis. To say I was doubting the quality of the youth's perspective I supposedly have to offer is an understatement. But it didn't take much, just opening the book really, for me to realise that this wasn't going to be some impenetrable 89-page Life and Times. No, it was clear from the beginning that the Disruptive Pilgrim's Guide was written in clear parallel to its subject, modest, compassionate, and remarkably accessible. Dedicated to my late mother Patricia, who lived to see her daughters afforded their rightful place in society, and to those nieces and grandnieces of mine who wonder what place there is for them in the church today. I'd sat down with a pen and paper next to me, and just by the dedication, I already had something to write about. An acknowledgement of social progress, and refreshingly the way in which the church still struggles to keep up. Father Frank went on to introduce us to the late Pope, illustrating him as the Pope of personal encounter and master of the symbolic gesture. Upon reading this, I found myself cautious. It's common for a leader to be able to talk the talk, rare not to be able to. It's walking the walk so that people may follow that seems to prove difficult for those in power, both in this country and countless others across the globe. This kind of hollow authority is something that I personally have felt immense frustration at. As the next generation, there's this kind of constant messaging of, in 15 years, in 10, in 5, you will be the politicians and doctors and artists who keep the world turning. This will all be yours. Which is well and good until you take a look at what we're being given to work with. A mental health pandemic, the rising cost of living, ever-present racial tensions, news headlines paying more heed to regressing global superpowers than war-torn countries. The ever-growing imminence of keeping the world turning is suddenly a much less enticing idea, especially when it seems those responsible for doing so now are all too ready to palm it off. Which is why I have to say, when I read of the controversy Pope Francis elicited, I found it difficult to view this supposedly negative attribute as such. Here was a man held in the highest regard, willing to make waves and cause discomfort for the cause of what he believed was right, willing to disrupt. Here was Pope Francis prompting about 1.2 billion people around the world to build bridges and acknowledging his own flaws as a sinner. Pretty words, certainly, but the ramifications of which ran far deeper. Whether that 2013 conclave knew so or not, in Pope Francis they appointed far more than a ceremonial figurehead. They had chosen a man of the people, for the people, one who would proceed to raise deep-rooted ecclesiastical issues that had been gathering dust for far too long. Despite a frustrating habit of tabling arguably the more controversial of these, the groundwork was laid nonetheless. The groundwork was laid for a church that forces its followers to question the nature of their own faith, drawing into question the validity of blind adherence in the context of a modern society. To question, in Pope Francis's own words, what they are praying for, to go forward or to go back. Thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa, for your reflections on Father Frank's book. It is important to have a student voice, and I think we would all agree that your comments certainly add value. We are very grateful that Fr Eamonn Conway has been able to join us this evening. Father Eamonn is visiting from Ireland and is working with the Archdiocese of Perth and the University of Notre. He was appointed by Pope Francis to the Synod on Synodality and has written extensively about some of Pope Francis's encyclicals and exhortations. Please join me in welcoming Father Eamonn to launch Father Frank's book in Perth and offer us some insights.
My dear friends, it's really a great honour to be here this evening. I'm very grateful for this invitation. I'm so delighted that it worked out with my time over here. I arrived in actually just this night last week. So please excuse if not only do I put you to sleep, but I start nodding off myself in the course of the presentation. I don't think that will happen, at least with me. I hope it won't happen with you. So we're still less than a year from the death of Pope Francis, and usually we need some sense of distance to assure perspective. It's difficult, for example, to appreciate a piece of art, say a beautiful painting, if we're up too close to it. We need to step back so we can actually have a sense of what it's truly about. So too, I would have thought, when writing an account of a papacy, especially one, as indeed has been mentioned already, as one that is as revolutionary and therefore as contested as that of Pope Francis. I've no doubt, however, that the rich perspective that Father Brennan brings in this book to us will stand the test of time as we grow in our appreciation of what, in my view, and I think we will all come to recognise in due course, has been the most transformative of the papacies we've had since Vatican II. Father Frank's ability to provide us with such a rich perspective so speedily is, I believe, down to two things. And we've only met tonight for the first time, so I'm intuiting a little bit here, so I hope I don't get it too wrong. The first is that as a fellow son of St. Ignatius of Loyola, Frank is on the inside track when it comes to understanding and interpreting Pope Francis's life and legacy. As he himself states in the book, this is a Jesuit's testimony to a Jesuit pope. The second is because in addition to being fellow Jesuits, the two Francises were, I suggest, also kindred spirits. Now, I've already met a few people around the room who have Irish accents, and they'll understand immediately when I communicate an Irish saying we have in Irish, Aithnín Círóg, Círóg Ella. Would anybody translate that for me? It literally means one beetle recognizes another beetle, but it's the equivalent in the Irish language of the English idiom, it takes one to know one. And I could suggest to you perhaps it takes one disruptor to know another disruptor. That Pope Francis and Father Francis, or Frank, are kindred spirits is evident, indeed, from the warmth with which, and the affection with which the Disruptive Pilgrim's Guide is so evidently written. And none of the passion evident in this book leads in any way to a loss of perspective or compromises the book's scholarliness. The opposite, in fact, is the case. Dispassion would have been most unhelpful in an attempt to account for a papacy as passionate as that of Pope Francis. The warmth and affection is particularly evident when it comes to Father Frank's account of three key themes that form the three key chapters of the book: pleading for our planet, Laudato Si; being realistic about families and human relationships, Amoris Laetitia, or the joy of love; and being fraternal towards all, Fratelli Tutti. It's important to emphasize that Pope Francis, this Disruptive Pilgrim's Guide, is not just valuable to us as an account of Pope Francis's legacy, and that reading it might be some kind of a exercise in nostalgia. Far from it. The reason why we need to engage in this book so, I would say, so urgently and so with so attention is the continuity that we already can see between Francis and Leo. just as the papacies of Pope John Paul and Pope Benedict XVI were one papacy programmatically speaking, so also, I believe, is the case with those of Pope Francis and Pope Leo. Father Brennan helpfully dedicates a chapter to providing context and background to Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. This was the exhortation, the first document that was really his own, of Pope Francis in 2013, and provided the roadmap for his pontificate. It is also significantly the most cited papal document by Pope Leo since he came into office. And right from the word go, he was citing it. The day after he was elected, he met with the College of Cardinals. By the way, in case I doubted myself, I checked that with AI. Okay? Confirms what I said. So the continuity that's there between Popes Francis and Leo means that we need to continue to deepen our grasp of concepts under Francis that have become central to the mission and life of the Church and will continue, I believe, to be so central. Discernment is one of these key concepts. And as a Jesuit, Father Brennan is well placed to unpack it in accessible language as he does. He reminds us, for instance, that shortly after convoking the Synod on Synodality, Pope Francis dedicated 13 of his weekly audiences to schooling us, I quote, in the art of discernment, being attentive to all the evidence and all points of view, being aware of all motivations at play, being aware of the movements of the good spirit and the bad spirit, and coming to a decision with true indifference. Knowledge, experience, and emotion are indispensable for discernment. End of quote. If I can just even leave my text aside for a moment, it would be wonderful. I'm sure it already happens, maybe even unconsciously, but for so many young people and in our schools that we actually allow ourselves to be schooled in the art of discernment, because it gives us, I suppose, a really powerful way of making important decisions in life. And of exercising our gifts in a way that builds harmony and community. And Evangelii Gaudium is actually permeated with references to the importance of discernment. I don't think we picked it up as much then as we probably should or could have, that it was already there. All the seeds, in fact, of Pope Francis' pontificate that later we began to see grow were already in Evangelii Gaudium. Now, in another chapter, his chapter entitled Being Conscientiously Realistic About Families and Relationships, Father Brennan reminds us that the invitation to discernment also lies at the heart of the joy of love, or Amoris Laetitia. This is the exhortation that followed from the first two synods held by Pope Francis. One was in 2014 and a second one in 2015. The 2014 synod was an extraordinary synod of a smaller number. It was the heads or the presidents of episcopal conferences. And the title was The Pastoral Challenges of the Family in the Context of Evangelization. And then we had an ordinary synod, the 14th Ordinary Synod of Bishops, a much bigger synod on vocation and mission in the family and in the church. Discernment is the key to addressing the tension, and I'm quoting Father Brennan here, between moral teaching and pastoral solicitude. How do we hold together, if you like, truth and love? How do we hold together what God expects of us and yet the tensions we find in our own lives, perhaps, in responding to this? And the Church, in and through Amoris Laetitia, which is a magisterial document, teaches us that we are called to form people's consciences, but not to replace them. And so discernment, we're invited to accompany people with the skills to discern in their own circumstances, be it irregular relationships or whatever, how they can respond as best they can in their circumstances to the demands of the gospel with integrity and with authenticity. We don't do the discerning for them, we enable them to engage in discernment. And I consider it a really serious shame that to this day, Amoris Laetitia, which, as I say, emerged from two synods over 10 years ago, and is church teaching, has not yet really been widely received. Its non or only partial reception explains why the painful, pressing pastoral problems and issues affecting people in irregular unions, same-sex relationships, surfaced again at the Synod on Synodality, the one that just concluded in 24. It also explains why the Synod on Synodality was necessary, namely to fix the ineffectiveness of synods. This brings us to the chapter of Father Brennan's book on the topic of synodality. At the heart of synodality is embedding processes of dialogue, of discernment, and of decision-making. Not only that, but also of transparency and of accountability into every level of church governance, be that local, be that at diocesan level, be that at national level or universal church level. Father Brennan addresses the topic of synodality primarily in terms of the recent synod's failure to deliver sufficiently on what he calls the key vexed questions confronting the church. And foremost among these vexed questions, he identifies the issue of how women are treated in the church. He also highlights the handling of the abuse crisis and reform, badly needed reform, that still needs to happen in the Curia, as examples, the Roman Curia, as examples of unfinished business from the pontificate of Pope Francis. Now, I was at the Synod, so you'll allow me to say a few words that go maybe a little bit further than the book, but I think it's important to say it, because I spent the morning actually with the agencies, the lead agencies of the Archdiocese here, discussing this. Synodality is about seats at the table. It establishes, or more accurately, re-establishes the principle, to put it colloquially, nothing about me without me. A church that embraces the core responsibility of all the baptized for the mission of the church, and this at every level. That acknowledges no higher dignity than that of the baptized. That recognizes the role of the baptized in decision-making process in the church. And that accepts synodality as the most appropriate framework for interpreting the hierarchical ministry, the ministry of the ordained. We ordained are at the service of the ministry of the baptized. Such a church, in my view, will be best placed to address and resolve the vexed questions to which Father Brennan has drawn our attention, and many others. So Evangelii Gaudium, the Joy of the Gospel 2013, and the final document of the Synod in 2024, they bookend the pontificate of Pope Francis. And if you read them together, you will see I was in the Boy Scouts for years. I learned more about teaching and communication from being a scout leader than I ever did in the seminary, I have to be honest. But one of the things we learned in scouting, if you were giving a talk, was say what you're going to do it, and say what you did, right? 3 sections. Pope Francis said what he was going to do in Evangelii Gaudium. He set out doing it, and the final document effectively, while it doesn't quite say what he did, but it brings it to a certain level of achievement. We're now in the implementation phase, 3 important years of implementation. That in itself is a statement that Synod outcomes can't simply sit on the back of the shelf. I'm convinced that synodality will be Pope Francis's most enduring legacy, because it is the vehicle for implementing Vatican II. And here, I suppose, I want to put a little twist on the title of the book, because one could say really that Pope Francis was not just a disruptor, but he was a restorer, because he actually has brought us back on track for the implementation of Vatican II. Even though it's a relatively short book, there are too many rich insights for me to address in all of them here. I just want to say in conclusion, this book has already been launched twice in 2 other parts of Australia, in each case by archbishops, no less. So this is a bit of a letdown, but anyway. There is something special, however, about launching it here among the community of John the 23rd College. This is because he wrote much of this book while on sabbatical here, and he wrote it for you. He wrote it for you, the students, staff, teachers, systems leaders, all who serve the mission of Catholic education. And you know, it's much easier when you're writing something to have concrete people in mind that you're in a conversation with. And you were them. You were the people he was writing for. He set out to provide you with a readable resource, an accessible resource, the word has been used already by others, which it is, for appreciating and appropriating the teaching of Pope Francis, and I believe he's accomplished this both beautifully and masterfully. And he has done so with the expert collaboration of Mrs. Janeen Murphy, this college's Deputy Principal for Faith and Mission. And Janeen has provided each chapter with really helpful questions to aid reflection, for which the reader will no doubt be grateful. And so, in case either of them are too polite to ask, may I conclude by asking you to please make both their efforts worthwhile by buying and reading the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Eamonn, for these insights. I would like to invite you to join Father Frank and Mrs. Murphy, our Deputy Principal of Faith and Mission, to the stage to continue to unpack Pope Francis, the Disruptive Pilgrim's Guide. Mrs. Murphy contributed to Father Frank's book by writing a series of questions that was designed to help teachers in Catholic schools engage with their faith, educational vocation, and church teachings inspired by the legacy of Pope Francis.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah, lovely, thank you. All right. Thank you, gentlemen. So, Frank, we might start with you, if that's okay. Can you just give us because you wrote the book. Can you tell us what prompted you to actually write the book? What were you thinking about, and why did you want to frame it as a guide?
Sure. Might I just start by thanking all those who have contributed. Alyssa, no doubt about the value that young people can contribute. That's one of the main reasons it was written. And you were testimony to that value, so thank you. And Daniel, for you as principal to open up these possibilities. And Father Eamonn, with your breadth of experience, particularly in synodality, to have opened it up so internationally, I'm very flattered. So thank you. Why write a book like this? Pope Francis had died in April last year. It just happened, I had a number of appointments, so by the time I got here in August last year, I calculated I had given talks to about 2,000 Catholic teachers around Australia and to a countless number of students. And what struck me was that people were wondering what the effect of Pope Francis would be in the long term, particularly as they were aware that in the last couple of years of his pontificate, there had been some very strong criticisms of him, and some of those criticisms came from very influential cardinals. And the fact was that Pope Leo, who was relatively unknown to us, but he was elected very quickly after the fourth ballot. And so it was known that he was one who was thought not just by those who were fans of Pope Francis, but also by those who were the greatest critics of Pope Francis, that this might be the man to take us forward. And so it seemed to me that what was confronting us as church was that indeed Pope Francis had created a certain momentum, and particularly in terms of making the church relevant for young people or those who are unchurched. But Pope Leo had been elected with an emphasis on unity. And basically, in order to create that unity, that he would need to proceed more slowly and in a more orderly fashion. And that being the case, I thought we cannot afford to lose the momentum, and we cannot afford for young people in our schools to lose touch with what was actually so bold and energetic in what Francis did. So I thought writing something like this might help.
Excellent, thank you. Frank, the book speaks to both committed Catholics and those who are on the margin. And what do you hope wounded or even sceptical readers might take from it?
I would hope, coming back to Alyssa's point about value, I would hope that they would take a sense that my life experience is valued, my reflection on that life experience is valued, and there is value in a church tradition and a church teaching and a church pastoral solicitude. And that though I might not here have all the answers, I know that I am relating to someone who was Pope who was so real. I think Father Eamonn would agree with me. Pope Francis never pretended to have the theological competence of a Benedict or a John Paul II. He basically said, look, I take all that as read, but basically I don't know that it's answering a lot of the questions which I have encountered as the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, particularly amongst those who are poor and unlettered. And so, that being the case, that we have to be able to give further articulation to that.
Excellent. Eamonn, I'll bring you into the conversation now. For both of you, Pope Francis often spoke about a church as a field hospital. And how do you think this image actually shaped his approach to leadership?
Okay, so just before I answer that, as the politicians say, just to take up a couple of points from I will come to the field hospital because I think it's a wonderful image, to a couple of the points that Frank made. I suppose the first one is that Leo, yes, I think was perhaps again no more than Francis was elected by the cardinals to sort out corruption, both financial and moral, but he did an awful lot more than that. I think perhaps you're right that Leo has been elected for unity, but it's not, I think it's important to stay with that word for a moment because there's two related words. It's not going to be about uniformity. And you see, I think the rupture, the disruption that we had with Francis, which I will continue with Leo, is from a Eurocentric, a European mindset and mentality, thinking that this could be easily transplanted to the world church. And essentially what has happened with Francis, and there's a perfect example of this, and stop me if I'm getting too technical, but there's a perfect example. Pope Benedict gave a talk not long after being in office, where he talked, it was the Regensburg address, where he talked about how, there was a particularly wonderful moment when Christianity found in Greco-Roman civilization a vehicle to evangelize the world. And he couldn't think outside of the fact that you needed that Greco-Roman culture. And if Western culture was dying, it meant Christianity would die. In Evangelii Gaudium, Francis turns that completely around and says, hold on, we can't expect that the particular forms the Christian faith took at one particular moment in one particular cultural context will actually be the only ones that matter. So what really, and this is again where synodality is so important, it's a way of avoiding, frankly, schism in the church. It's a way of holding unity while acknowledging the need for plurality, or pluriformity is the word I prefer. So think of people living and working in Buenos Aires, as Father Brennan said, or here, or in Zimbabwe, or in the west of Ireland. We need unity while acknowledging strong cultural and differences, and we need to hold the church together. So what we've found, and what Francis has enabled, is that unity with unity without returning to uniformity. And Leo will continue that because of his own experience of the Global South. So back to the image of the field hospital. Some of us here in the room may remember MASH. Da 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 da. Do you remember Do you remember, Frank? MASH was a mobile army surgical hospital. Okay, it was a comedy. Alan Alda was one of the actors. You'll find it on Netflix, or probably maybe not. You'll find it on YouTube somewhere. MASH, and it was based on I think the Korean War. That's my image of a field hospital in a sense. And in a field hospital, as Pope Francis beautifully described it in his very first interview, they're not going to ask you, you need to be more careful about your blood pressure, and I hope your cholesterol. No, if you have a broken knee or a wounded knee, that's what you go for. You fix the wounds, heal the wounds, he says, and that heal the wounds. Then you can talk to people about other issues, about ways they need to change their lives and so on. And so, yeah, I hope we don't lose sight of that rich image, because we're in a very, in your address, you spoke about all the different forms of woundedness, really, in our culture. You talk about mental health and so on. And we need that tenderness. I mean, some people have called Pope Francis's pontificate a revolution of tenderness. Cardinal Casper wrote a book. We need that sense of tenderness at the moment. We need a sense of being held at the moment. A lot of the background mood music in our culture is sinister at the moment. We've the breakdown of trust as enormous. So I do hope we hold on to that image.
And could I just add that, I mean, for earlier generations of Catholics who were brought up on the idea that the litmus test was that you go to Mass every Sunday, you don't check into a field hospital every Sunday. You attend the field hospital, you're then cured, and you're sent out back on mission. And that's what's so radical about the Francis agenda, that we as church, we as the people of God, we are sent to be reconcilers in a broken world, and that we can find resources, we can find support in the church community, but we're designed for mission.
Excellent, thank you. So this idea of the disruptive pilgrim, what kind of disruption do you think that the church is in most need of today?
Well, I think it's...
Bit eager there, Frank.
As Alyssa touched on, I think it needs a lot of disruption in terms of catching up with some of the cultural realities of the society in which we find ourselves. Alyssa read out the dedication I had in the book to my mother, because I recall that, like, I've got 23 nephews and nieces, and I became a great uncle recently for the 33rd time. And I know, talking with grandnieces in particular, that the idea that you can have an institution which does all sorts of cartwheels in order to avoid the acknowledgement of the equal dignity of all persons, regardless of gender, and the equal availability of all officers within the institution. As I say, my mother, when she was young, the idea that there would be a woman Prime Minister or a woman Chief Justice or a woman Governor General was unthinkable. My grandnieces, they've all known a woman Chief Justice, a woman Prime Minister, and even 2 women Governors General. Now, we're living in a very different cultural context now, and we need to become more disruptive in the church about that sort of question. And also we have to be asking ourselves on issues, for example, to do with climate change, where young people in particular keep saying to us, don't you see that the planet is going to hell in a basket? Now, we keep getting told, don't worry, there's not much we can do about it, so let's do nothing. Whereas Pope Francis is constantly putting before us in all that he said and did in this area, saying, we as the church don't have all the answers, but my God, we've got to be prudent, and we've got to listen to the experts, and we've got to act. So we have not to be afraid of becoming more radical in terms of articulating those sorts of social messages.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take just 2, I suppose, additional maybe examples. One more perhaps global, one more local. I think in the West, Europe here, the US and so on, I know I personally need to allow my conscience to be disturbed more by the suffering and the inequality and the hurt that is there in so many parts of our world, and deepen my sense of solidarity with my brothers and sisters who are fellow Christians, but not just fellow Christians. By 2050, 70% of the world's Catholics will be in the global south. They'll be living in poverty. They'll be living as a minority among another world religion, and they will be persecuted. That is statistically the direction which we're going. And it explains a lot of where the energy of Pope Leo and Pope Francis has been, because they realize that's, we probably think in the West we're still important, but relatively speaking we're not. And this is the great thing, that Pope Francis gave a voice to the world church in the Synod. I was at a Synod in 2012. Pope Francis didn't bother to turn up at that Synod. He saw this was a kind of a Western European. It was on the new evangelization, but he saw that as a European project. He wasn't interested. He was still the Archbishop of Buenos Aires. He'd handed in his resignation, and he expected, this was in 2012, 3 months before he became Pope. But the next phone call he was expecting was to say, "Thank you, Your Eminence, your resignation has been accepted." And end of show. But he helped us now to see the world church and to see the needs of our brothers and sisters and our suffering brothers and sisters. And I just think our Christianity over here can become very easily decadent, frankly. We're not moved. We see the images, but we're not moved by them. So that's one of my thoughts. We just don't need that deeper sense of solidarity, much more locally. And it's wonderful to have the experience of visiting schools here and meeting so many extraordinarily well-resourced, and I don't mean that just in terms of financial resources, but that the people you have. I do a fair bit of work with SIWA, and I see some SIWA people here. What I think we need to do is deepen our confidence in the distinctiveness of what Catholic education is about, and realize the great gift it is, and not be too easily swayed by an educational system that's becoming increasingly transactional, that's becoming increasingly bureaucratic, that's squeezing out the human, that's losing the sense of education as a vocation. That, I think, would be, to me, something very precious, so that these young people, and so many young people, still go through an educational system where education is experienced as a vocation, and accompanying people in the deeper questions of meaning, not allowing them to be easily eclipsed. Not to come in with a rush in with an answer to those questions, but accompany and journey with people as they explore the deeper questions of life and the deeper questions of meaning. Because as you mentioned the mental health crisis, I'm convinced that that's connected with the suppression of these deeper questions of meaning. That we turn them in on ourselves, we're not able to address them, and it causes anxiety.
Excellent, thank you. All right, we'll have the last question before we go to your closing remarks, Frank. Some would say that Pope Francis changed the tone of the papal leadership more than doctrine. What tone do you each think we can expect from Pope Leo?
I think that's definitely right in that there's no doctrine Francis changed. He changed a lot of practices, and he basically said, look, you've got to get over this idea that Rome has the answers and you're just running a branch office out there at the end of the earth. You've got to get over this idea that Father will tell you what's best, that you have to form your conscience and to that conscience be true. But most significantly in terms of tone, it was that all of us, even if we be Pope, have to show absolute respect for the dignity of every human person in the situation in which they find themselves. So whether it's with the man who had the acute disability that he embraced, or whether it's in relation to who am I to judge, in relation to the person who is gay, the tone is one of acceptance of the fact that God works in very mysterious ways, and guess what? God works even in your life, no matter what the mess or complexity of that life, and that the Church has good news which is joyful, redemptive, hopeful and real, regardless of the circumstances, even of the secularist environment in which you find yourself. So in the end, I think it's a message of, or a tone of joy and hope, rather than one of judgment and despair.
Thank you.
So during what was called the continental stage of the Synod, which was where we had 7 different parts of the world where people gathered to reflect on the issues and questions arising. And the motto or the slogan for that stage was taken from the prophet Isaiah: expand the space of your tent. I don't know if you remember, that was a kind of an image. Expand the space of your tent, make firm the pegs and stretch the fabric. It's a line, I think it's from Isaiah. I think Francis, if you like, gave us the first part of that, expanding the space of our tent, and there's no going back on that. Told us, all. But I think Leo, we will see, is going to make firm the pegs of the tent. He's going to make sure it doesn't come down. He's going to stretch the fabric to make sure it's durable. He's a canon lawyer by profession. He's a very different temperament. But I don't think there's any change in the direction in terms of the implementation of the Second Vatican Council. I think he's a more measured person in terms of personality, and we need both. We need both. We needed the courage to you see, the Synod had become a prisoner of the Curia, really, and Francis released that and has now given it back. And the Synod isn't important itself. The Synod is important insofar as it allows the whole world church to guide the world church. That's why it's important, and that's what has now come back into play. So I'm very confident in Leo's orientation and direction. I do think he will want and needs to bring people with him, but I think there's steel in him. The way he's spoken, for example, about the political crisis, particularly in the US, sometimes you may have to read between the lines, but it's there. It's absolutely there. When you look around at the moment, the devastation on the world stage, in terms of politicians we can have any confidence in, and Alyssa referred to this as well, I would encourage young people, if you are, we're looking, read Pope Leo's address to the on the 6th of January to the diplomatic corps, for example. There's really solid stuff in there. So he is, I think, the right man for the right time for us at this point. Frankly, and I don't want to sound ominous, but we need a wartime pope, and we've got a wartime pope.
Excellent. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Frank, I'll hand over to you for some closing remarks.
Well, in my closing remarks, I'd like to do two things. First, I would like to thank you as the John 23rd community. It was such an inspiration for me to be part of this community while I was writing this book. I think to have a community of faith which is grounded, which is real, fair dinkum, built on good and respectful relationships, particularly between students and staff, I think is just fabulous. So a real tribute to the school. As Alyssa and many who were there at the Atticus Finch Awards last year might remember, I became quite emotional when it came to the judging of the awards. I was so moved that young people could display such passion and such insight in relation to such critical issues confronting our society. And those of us who are older often presume that that is not the case. And to be able to harness that within this community, I think, is a wonderful thing. And in particular, I would like to pay tribute to Janeen, who did not only push me along this path of this book, but also formulating the very useful questions at the end of each chapter. And Fr Eamonn, thank you very much for the honour you've done us tonight, for coming along, and how good it is that, well, the Archbishop couldn't be with us, but I'd have to say the Irish substitute has done very well indeed, and we're very pleased to have you with us. The second thing I'd like to do is just conclude with a few words about transition from Francis to Leo, because of course that's not in the book, but we're now some months on. I didn't say it in the book, and I know it's very irreverent, but I'll say it now. I think Francis lived 3 years too long. I think if he died 3 years earlier, I think most of what he was wanting to achieve would have been achieved, although maybe not with the synod processes. But the forces which were galvanising against him became very strong in Rome in those last 3 years, and particularly with what were called the Demos documents, which were circulated, describing Francis's pontificate as a disaster, a catastrophe, and outlining the priorities for the next pope. And might I quote them to you? Restore normality, restore doctrinal clarity, restore a proper respect for the law and for the nomination of bishops, all of that sort of thing. Even our own Cardinal Pell wrote an article just before he died condemning the Synod on Synodality as a toxic nightmare. So it was a very poisoned atmosphere at that time. Let's note this. In his address to the College of Cardinals, 2 days after his election, Leo urged the cardinals to get back and follow the path of Vatican II. He told them, Pope Francis masterfully and concretely set it forth in the apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium. That was an act of singular courage by Leo to tell all of those cardinals, including those who had formulated the Demos documents, make no mistake, the one you have elected in record time, I am here to state unequivocally that Francis masterfully and concretely set forth the agenda in Evangelii Gaudium. Now, it's too early to say if Pope Leo will trim back some of Francis's initiatives, insisting that the church doors be better supervised by the clergy and that the synod processes be more controlled by the bishops. His episcopal motto has always been Augustine's line, in illo uno unum, in him who is one, Christ, we are one. At the Mass for the beginning of his pontificate on the 18th of May, he said this, I would like that our first great desire be for a united church, a sign of unity and communion, which becomes a leaven for a reconciled world. Leo wants to follow Francis's groundbreaking path, but he wants to do it more slowly and in a more orderly manner so as to bring more people with him. If he moves too slowly, and if he insists on too much order, and do remember he's got a doctorate in canon law, the Demos cardinals might be satisfied, but many of those inspired by Francis might simply follow their own spiritual path. Leo needs to maintain both momentum and unity. And the challenge to everyone here tonight, particularly the young people in our midst, is for God's sake and for the sake of the world, maintain the Francis momentum and trust that unity will follow. Thank you.
As we conclude this evening, I'd like to offer a thank you to everyone who has helped make this evening so special. To our advancement and maintenance teams, thank you all for the work behind the scenes pulling this event together. We are grateful to Mr. Daniel Mann, our college principal, for grounding tonight in the life, mission and spirit of John 23rd College. Our appreciation goes also out to Alyssa Minyaka, the 2025 Atticus Finch Justice Award winner, for your insight, honesty, and for reminding us how powerfully young people are responding to the call for justice and compassion. Thank you to Fr Eamonn Conway for sharing your wisdom and perspective, and for helping us reflect on the wider journey of the Church at this moment in time. And a very special thank you to Father Frank Brennan, not only for your contribution this evening, but for your time with us as an academic in residence in 2025. We are deeply grateful for the way you engaged with our community, our students, and our staff, and for the generosity and thoughtfulness you brought to that time with us. As we head out this evening, perhaps we might take with us the image at the heart of this book, that we are all pilgrims, each on our own journey. Pope Francis invites us to be open to being disrupted, not for the sake of disruption itself, but so that we can grow. He calls us to help build a church and a world shaped by encounter, compassion, and hope. Maybe tonight gives us an opportunity to reflect on how each of us is being invited to respond to that call, in our own lives and communities. If you would like to purchase a copy of the book, please feel free to do so on your way out, or you can use the QR code on the screen to order your copy. Thank you for being a part of this evening.